My name is Sana Mirza, and I'm joined today with my colleague Zulfikar Hirji. We are talking today about Islamic manuscripts in East Africa, particularly the Qur'ans of the Swahili coast and an Ethiopian Qur'an from Harar, which is today in the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library collection in Toronto. Zulfikar, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, great to have this conversation, Sana. And as Sana mentioned, I'm at York University, and I am working on a corpus of Islamic manuscripts, particularly Qur'ans that have been produced in the Swahili coast, particularly in the Lama archipelago, in a place called Pate Island.
Zulfikar, one question that we've been posed today is thinking about these manuscripts and the sort of larger traditions that they speak to, namely thinking about the long distance trade routes that crisscrossed the continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe. How do you feel your manuscripts in particular speak to these larger questions?
Well, I think partly the manuscripts that I'm working on, their characteristics, the materials they use, the skills displayed in them in terms of calligraphy, in terms of the content, the annotations, and so on. One often thinks about this part of the East African coast as some kind of, remote place. But at the time of the late sort of 18th, 19th century, early 19th century, these places were really centers of incredible ingenuity and production. And I think that speaks to the ways in which the Silk Roads, both at the time of their kind of development and also in their afterlives, had so much to say about how these communities were integrated across vast distances, both along land routes, but also along sea routes. The Indian Ocean was central to this, set of developments. Yeah, and how things moved across these different places in terms of book production. I think oftentimes there's, in the terms of the Silk Road and the Silk routes, there's been kind of this east-west conversation, almost from sort of the Mediterranean, the far reaches of the Mediterranean into the Iberian Peninsula, and then through Central Asia into China. And perhaps also touching on South Asia and maybe sometimes Southeast Asia. But Africa seems to be sort of not part of that full conversation. And yet some of the most important raw materials that the Silk Road boasted in terms of ivory and precious metals and all sorts of different objects that went into different kinds of object production were central to this historical route. I think that there's lots of explorations to be done, which would fully engage sub-Saharan Africa into the conversation.
And that's one reason I'm so interested in Harar in particular is I do think it allows us to challenge some of these perhaps biases that are in the way that Islamic art is presented today or the canon of Islamic art is presented. Our topic today, thinking about these manuscript traditions, starting this conversation is an object that was highlighted in the exhibition and is today in the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library in Toronto. This manuscript comes from Harar, Ethiopia, and it was likely produced at the very end of the 18th century. It's rather unique in quite a number of ways, but it's also representative of what I would describe as sort of a larger Harari corpus of manuscripts. The red and green colorful bands or the strapwork borders can be found in the hundreds of manuscripts that were produced in Harar between the 17th and 19th centuries. It's also representative of this corpus by the inclusion of such numerous paratextual materials. On the upper half of the panels here, you can see these elaborate introductions naming surahs and talking about differences between different schools of qira'at or recitation. The zigzagging marginal blurbs are also pulling out these recitation information. And then the most elaborate part of the composition is definitely the surah text, which you can see kind of in the lower part of the composition within the green bands. The manuscript is also produced on likely Italian paper, and you can see that the tajweed markers are indicated in red and green. Um, but this manuscript is really representative of an entire tradition. And here you can just see a few of the manuscripts one finds in Harar today. And there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of manuscripts that survive. These manuscripts give just a glimpse of the variety, but also the development of what I would describe as the clear stylistic choices and traditions within Harar. I also wanted to highlight here a traditional Harari binding. These are often stamped and they have an envelope flap that sort of curves over the open edge of the text block. Qur'ans are the most common manuscripts one finds in Harar. There are also other religious texts like the Dala'il al-Khairat, and as well as legal and other religious but non-Quranic manuscripts. Another thing that I find really interesting is the watermarks. And so many of them have watermarks and the laid and chain lines that are show that they're European paper. And I'm so thrilled that the exhibition is allowing for these manuscripts to represent the diverse manuscript cultures of East Africa and work against the whether it's bias or discrimination that has allowed the African narrative to be overlooked.